Montana Territory, 1879. The unforgiving prairie stretched beyond the horizon, golden grasses bending beneath a relentless wind that carried both promise and peril. In these untamed lands, 26-year-old Zachary Quinn had learned one truth above all others. A man stands alone against the wilderness. The frontier demanded strength without weakness, survival without sentiment. Love was a luxury that got men killed, a distraction from the vigilance required to see the next sunrise. Zach adjusted his Stetson against the late afternoon sun, his tanned face showing the weathering of one who'd spent too many years under open skies. Despite his youth, fine lines had already formed at the corners of his eyes from squinting across vast distances. His lean frame carried the coiled strength of a man accustomed to hard physical labor, and though his shoulders were broad, they seemed burdened by more than just the weight of his worn leather vest. "Come on, Tommy," he called to the small boy struggling to keep up with him along the rutted main street of Whispering Pines. The 5-year-old was the spitting image of his father, with the same wheat-colored hair and serious blue eyes. "We need to get supplies before the mercantile closes." The boy nodded solemnly, quickening his pace. He rarely complained, rarely asked for anything, a trait that twisted something painful in Zach's chest. Children should want things, should laugh and play, but Tommy had grown old before his time, just like his father. "Papa, can I have a peppermint stick?" Tommy asked, his voice barely audible above the creak of wagon wheels and distant piano from the saloon. Zach softened, reaching to ruffle the boy's hair. "Just one, and only because you helped with the calves this morning." A flicker of a smile crossed Tommy's face before disappearing, like a match struck in darkness that quickly gutters out. Those smiles came so rarely since Martha had passed during the influenza outbreak last winter. Zach's sister-in-law had raised Tommy after his brother's death 2 years prior, and when the sickness took her, Zach found himself the reluctant guardian of a nephew who'd already lost too much. "What do I know about raising a child?" he'd asked the empty bunkhouse that first night after the funeral. The wilderness had no answer but the howling of distant wolves. The ranch needed tending, cattle needed moving, and a child needed raising. Zach did what he could, but deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. A boy needed a mother's touch, and that was the one thing Zach couldn't provide. The mercantile bell jingled as they entered, the warm scent of coffee beans, leather, and dried goods a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. Mrs. Henderson nodded from behind the counter, her weathered face crinkling into a sympathetic smile when she spotted Tommy. "Afternoon, Zach, Tommy. What can I help you with today?" "The usual," Zach replied, handing her his list. "And a peppermint for the boy." As Mrs. Henderson gathered their supplies, the bell above the door chimed again. Zach turned instinctively, his hand briefly hovering near the revolver at his hip, another frontier habit hard to break. But instead of threat, his eyes met warmth. She couldn't have been more than 23, with honey-golden hair arranged in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Her blue calico dress, while modest and practical, couldn't disguise the grace with which she moved. What struck Zach most, however, were her eyes, clear and green as spring grass, direct in their gaze, unflinching even when they met his. "Miss Dawson," Mrs. Henderson called cheerfully. "Your books arrived on yesterday's stage." "Thank you," she replied, her voice musical but firm. "I was beginning to worry they'd been lost." "Nothing gets lost that's addressed to our schoolteacher," Mrs. Henderson said with evident pride. "Whispering Pines may not be much, but we value education here." Zach watched the woman, Miss Dawson, with quiet assessment. He'd heard talk of the new schoolteacher arriving from Boston last month, but the Quinn ranch lay far enough from town that he'd had no occasion to cross paths with her until now. Tommy stared openly at her, his small face uncharacteristically animated. Miss Dawson noticed, offering him a gentle smile that transformed her already pretty features into something luminous. "Hello there," she said, crouching slightly to meet Tommy's eye level. "I don't believe I've seen you in my schoolroom." Tommy shrank back against Zach's leg, suddenly shy. Zach rested a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Tommy doesn't attend school," he said, his tone more defensive than he'd intended. "We live too far out, and the ranch needs tending." Something flashed in her green eyes, not judgment, exactly, but a quiet challenge. "Every child deserves education, Mr. Quinn." "Zachary Quinn." He nodded stiffly. And this is Tommy, my nephew. Penelope Dawson, she replied, extending her hand in a gesture so forthright it momentarily startled him. Women in these parts didn't typically offer handshakes like men in business dealings. After a moment's hesitation, he took her hand, finding her grip surprisingly firm. Education is valuable, Miss Dawson, but so is learning to survive on the frontier. Tommy's learning the things he needs to know. Instead of backing down, she smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. Perhaps both kinds of learning might serve him well, Mr. Quinn. Before Zach could formulate a response, Mrs. Henderson returned with his supplies and a small package for Miss Dawson. As the schoolteacher turned to leave, she paused beside Tommy. The schoolhouse door is always open, Tommy. We have stories, arithmetic games, and sometimes even cookies on Fridays. She looked up at Zach, that same quiet challenge in her gaze. Children need more than survival, Mr. Quinn. They need to thrive. With that, she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and a sense of disruption Zach couldn't quite name. She's pretty, Tommy said quietly as they loaded their supplies into the wagon. Zach grunted noncommittally, but found his eyes drifting toward the schoolhouse at the end of the street where Miss Dawson's blue calico dress had disappeared. Pretty, yes, but something else too. Something that unsettled the careful order he'd constructed around his solitary life. Can I go to school, Papa? Tommy asked, his voice tentative, as if expecting refusal. Zach looked down at the boy, seeing for the first time not just the responsibilities he represented, but the possibilities. The ranch was 15 miles from town, an impossible daily journey. But winter was coming, and the cattle would be moved to lower pastures soon. Perhaps they could stay in town occasionally, just through the worst of the weather. We'll see, he said finally, surprising himself as much as Tommy. Let's head home. As they rode away from town, Zach found himself thinking about green eyes and a voice that spoke of more than mere survival. The frontier had taught him to stand alone, to expect nothing but hardship. But watching Tommy's excitement over the simple possibility of school, he wondered if there were lessons about life he had yet to learn. 3 weeks later, a sudden snowstorm forced Zach's decision. The path to town was treacherous, but their ranch cabin had sustained damage to its roof that made sheltering there impossible until repairs could be made. With supplies loaded and Tommy bundled against the biting cold, they made their way carefully to Whispering Pines, where Zach had arranged lodging at the widow Carson's boarding house. We'll stay a week or two, he told Tommy as they settled into the modest but clean room. Just until I can get supplies to fix the roof. And yes, he added, seeing the question in the boy's eyes, you can attend school while we're here. Tommy's face transformed with such joy that Zach felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest. Had he been denying the boy something so essential? The thought troubled him as he tucked Tommy into bed that night, the boy chattering with more enthusiasm than Zach had heard in months. The next morning, they stood awkwardly at the schoolhouse door. Children's voices filtered through from inside, along with a woman's gentle but authoritative instructions. Zach hesitated, his hand on Tommy's shoulder. Remember your manners, he said gruffly, and pay attention to Miss Dawson's teaching. Tommy nodded solemnly, though excitement radiated from him. Zach knocked firmly, and moments later, the door swung open to reveal Penelope Dawson. Her honey-gold hair was arranged simply, a few tendrils escaping around her face. Her dress today was a deep forest green that matched her eyes, practical but becoming. Recognition, then pleasure, flickered across her face. Mr. Quinn, Tommy, what a wonderful surprise. Storm damaged our roof, Zach explained, feeling oddly like a schoolboy himself under her direct gaze. We're staying in town a spell. Tommy would like to join your class, if that's acceptable. More than acceptable, she replied warmly, extending her hand to Tommy. We're just starting our arithmetic lesson. Do you know your numbers, Tommy? The boy nodded shyly. Papa taught me counting for the cattle. Excellent. Then you'll fit right in. She looked up at Zach, and something in her expression made him stand straighter. Will you be collecting him at noon, Mr. Quinn? At the end of the school day, he corrected. I have business in town that will keep me occupied. Was that approval in her eyes? Very good. Tommy will be in excellent hands, I assure you. As Zach turned to leave, Tommy suddenly grabbed his hand. Papa, he whispered urgently. What if I don't know things the other children know? Zach crouched down, meeting the boy's anxious gaze. Then you'll learn. Quinn men aren't afraid of challenges. And Miss Dawson seems like a fine teacher. Penelope, who had overheard, stepped closer. I have a special helper position for new students, Tommy. Would you like to be my assistant today? The boy's face brightened immediately. Yes, ma'am. Then it settled. She smiled at Zach, and something warm unfurled in his chest. Good day, Mr. Quinn. Throughout the day, as Zach arranged for lumber and supplies, consulted with the blacksmith about a new plow blade, and settled accounts at the bank, his thoughts kept returning to the schoolhouse and its teacher. What was it about Penelope Dawson that disrupted his carefully ordered thinking? Perhaps it was the way she spoke to Tommy, not with the cloying sweetness some women affected with children, but with genuine respect. When school dismissed, Zach found himself waiting outside earlier than necessary. Children streamed past him, their faces rosy from the warm classroom and excited chatter filling the cold air. Finally, Tommy emerged, clutching a slate and primer. Papa, he called excitedly. Miss Dawson says I'm quick with numbers. Behind him, Penelope appeared in the doorway, wrapping a woolen shawl around her shoulders. The late afternoon light caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. Tommy has a natural aptitude for mathematics, she said, and he helped the younger children with remarkable patience. Pride swelled in Zach's chest. That's so. Indeed. Her eyes met his, direct and challenging. He's a credit to you, Mr. Quinn, though I wonder if he might benefit from regular schooling. The familiar defensiveness rose in Zach. The ranch is 15 miles out. Not practical for daily attendance. She nodded thoughtfully. Of course, though I should mention that the Miller family, who lived 12 miles in the opposite direction, board their children with relatives in town during the school term. I have no relatives in town, Zach replied tersely. There are other arrangements that might be made, she suggested, for a child who shows such promise. Before Zach could respond, Tommy tugged at his sleeve. Can we come back tomorrow, Papa? Miss Dawson is teaching about maps and explorations. Zach looked from the boy's hopeful face to Penelope's expectant one. Yes, he found himself saying. Tomorrow, and as long as we're in town. That evening at the boarding house, Tommy couldn't stop talking about school, the books, the other children, and especially Miss Dawson, who had read them a story about ancient Greek heroes and shown them on a globe where Greece was located. She knows everything, Papa, Tommy said, eyes wide with admiration. And she said tomorrow she'll show us how to make our own maps. Later, after Tommy had fallen asleep clutching his new primer, Zach sat by the window, watching snow blanket the town in pristine white. The storm that had driven them to town had proven fortunate for Tommy, at least. The boy was blossoming under Penelope Dawson's tutelage, showing a spark and energy Zach hadn't seen since before Martha's death. And what of Penelope herself? Zach found his thoughts returning to her, her forthright manner, her evident intelligence, the way her eyes seemed to see through his gruff exterior. Women in his experience fell into predictable categories: the hardy pioneer wives who worked alongside their husbands, the fragile Eastern transplants who rarely survived frontier hardships, and the saloon girls whose companionship could be purchased temporarily. Penelope Dawson fit none of these. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman who knew her own mind and value. She'd chosen to come west alone, to teach in a frontier town where luxuries were scarce and comforts few. That took courage, not the kind that faced down outlaws with a six-shooter, but perhaps a deeper sort. Zachary Quinn had survived by believing that connection was weakness, that a man stood strongest when he stood alone. Yet watching Tommy's transformation after just one day of school had shaken that conviction. Perhaps there were different kinds of strength, different ways to face the frontier's challenges. The thought troubled him as he finally sought his own bed, dreams filled with green eyes that seemed to ask questions he wasn't sure how to answer. Days stretched into a week, then two. The roofing materials Zach had ordered were delayed by continuing bad weather, extending their stay in town. Each morning, he escorted Tommy to school, exchanging increasingly comfortable greetings with Penelope. Each afternoon, he found himself arriving early to collect the boy, lingering to hear about Tommy's progress. He has a gift for storytelling, Penelope told him on the 10th day, as they watched Tommy helping younger children put away books. His composition about life on your ranch was remarkably vivid. That's so. Zach couldn't suppress his pride. His mother, my brother's wife, used to read to him nightly. I try to continue the tradition, though I'm not much for fancy words. Something softened in Penelope's expression. Yet you make the effort. That matters, Mr. Quinn. Zach, he said impulsively. My name is Zach. A small smile curved her lips. Zach, then. And I'm Penny to my friends. The exchange felt significant, though Zach couldn't have explained why. That evening, as they walked back to the boarding house, Tommy's small hand in his, Zach found himself noticing details of the town he'd previously overlooked. The careful Christmas decorations appearing in windows, the way neighbors called greetings to each other, the sense of community that permeated Whispering Pines. Miss Dawson is organizing a Christmas pageant, Tommy announced over dinner. All the school children participate. She says I can be a wise man because I'm good at remembering lines. Zach hesitated. Their roof supplies were due to arrive any day, and he'd planned to return to the ranch immediately afterward. Christmas was still 2 weeks away. We'll be back at the ranch by then, Tommy, he said gently. The boy's face fell, his disappointment so acute it was like a physical blow to Zach's chest. But Miss Dawson said I have an important part. The ranch needs tending, Zach explained, falling back on the practical necessities that had always guided his decisions. The cattle need checking after the storm. Couldn't we come back just for the pageant? Tommy asked, his voice small. Miss Dawson said parents always come to watch. Parents. The word hung between them, highlighting what Tommy lacked. A mother to sew his costume, to sit proudly in the audience, to smooth his hair, and whisper encouragement before he went on stage. I'll think about it, Zach said finally, unable to bear the disappointment in those small blue eyes so like his brother's. That night, unable to sleep, Zach stood at the window again, watching moonlight glint off the snow-covered street. In the distance, he could see lights still burning in the small cottage beside the schoolhouse where Penelope, Penny, lived. What was she doing awake at this hour? Preparing lessons? Reading one of her beloved books? The thought of her sitting alone by lamplight stirred something protective in him. The frontier was hard on women alone. Did she have enough firewood? Was her cottage warm enough against the bitter cold? Before he could question the impulse, Zach was pulling on his coat and boots. He told himself he was merely going to check the boarding house woodpile to ensure it was stocked for the night. But his feet carried him past the woodpile, down the moonlit street, toward the warm glow of Penelope's window. He was halfway there when he realized the absurdity of his actions. What would he say if she opened her door to find him standing there like some moon-addled fool? That he was concerned about her firewood supply? That he couldn't stop thinking about the way she smiled when Tommy answered a question correctly? Zach stopped abruptly, exhaling a plume of frost into the night air. This wasn't like him. He didn't make impulsive midnight calls on school teachers. He didn't concern himself with Christmas pageants or the longing in a small boy's eyes for things beyond practical necessities. Yet here he stood, changed somehow in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. With a last glance at the warm light of Penelope's window, he turned and made his way back to the boarding house, his thoughts in uncharacteristic disarray. The following afternoon, as school dismissed, Penelope approached him with unusual hesitation in her normally confident demeanor. Mr. Quinn, Zach, might I have a word with you? Tommy is helping arrange books and won't be ready for a few minutes. Of course, he replied, noting the slight color in her cheeks from the warmth of the schoolhouse, or perhaps something else. I understand you plan to return to your ranch soon, she began, her green eyes searching his face. Tommy mentioned as much, with particular disappointment about missing the Christmas pageant. Zach nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her gaze directly. The ranch can't be left untended indefinitely. I've responsibilities. Of course, she agreed readily. I would never suggest otherwise. But, she hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. Tommy has flourished these past weeks. His reading has improved remarkably, and he shows real aptitude for many subjects. More importantly, he's formed friendships with the other children. I've noticed, Zach acknowledged, thinking of the way Tommy now chattered excitedly about his school friends, so different from the solemn, quiet boy of just weeks ago. I wonder if you might consider an arrangement, Penelope continued. The Watson family has a son Tommy's age. They've mentioned they would be willing to board Tommy during the school term. Their farm is only 2 miles from town. The suggestion caught Zach off guard. Leave Tommy with strangers? The prospect felt like failure, an admission that he couldn't provide what the boy needed. I appreciate your concern, Miss Dawson, he said stiffly, retreating behind formality. But Tommy belongs with family. Something like disappointment flickered across her face. Of course, family is irreplaceable. She paused, then added quietly, I only thought to offer a solution that might serve Tommy's education without compromising your responsibilities at the ranch. Before Zach could respond, Tommy bounded up, clutching a carefully rolled paper. Miss Dawson helped me make a map of our ranch, Papa. From my description, Zach accepted the map, genuinely impressed by the detailed rendering of their property, complete with creek, grazing lands, and the cabin carefully positioned according to compass directions. This is fine work, Tommy, he said, ruffling the boy's hair. You've a good eye for detail. Miss Dawson says that's important for map makers. Tommy beamed up at his teacher, his adoration obvious. And for ranchers, too. Penelope smiled, though something guarded remained in her expression as she looked at Zach. Indeed, observation is a valuable skill in any profession. She gathered her shawl closer. I should prepare for tomorrow's lessons. Good evening to you both. As she turned to go, Tommy suddenly blurted, Miss Dawson, will you come to dinner at Mrs. Carson's boarding house? She said we could invite a guest, and Papa makes the best biscuits in the territory when Mrs. Carson lets him use her kitchen. Zach froze, mortified by the impromptu invitation and the mention of his rarely displayed cooking skill. But Penelope looked genuinely touched by the invitation. That's very kind of you, Tommy. If your father agrees, I would be delighted. All eyes turned to Zach, who found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the implications. We would be honored by your company, Miss Dawson. 7 o'clock. 7 it is, she agreed with a smile that seemed to chase away the winter chill. And please, it's Penny. As they walked back to the boarding house, Tommy skipping ahead with excitement over the dinner invitation, Zach wondered at the strange turn his life had taken. 3 weeks ago, he believed in a simple truth. The frontier demanded solitude, and connection was a luxury a man couldn't afford. Now, he found himself planning a dinner party, considering the merits of different educational arrangements for Tommy, and most disturbing of all, looking forward to an evening in the company of a green-eyed schoolteacher who challenged everything he thought he knew about strength and survival. The dining room at Mrs. Carson's boarding house had never looked so festive. The table was set with her good china, pinecone and holly decorations created by her boarders adorned the sideboard, and the aroma of fresh biscuits filled the air. Zach had indeed taken over the kitchen for an hour, much to Mrs. Carson's amusement, preparing the one dish his mother had taught him to make perfectly before her death. You're mighty concerned with those biscuits, Mr. Quinn, the widow observed with a knowing smile. I don't recall such attention to detail when you're just feeding yourself and Tommy. Zach chose not to respond, focusing instead on ensuring each biscuit was perfectly golden. He'd even shaved twice, much to Tommy's fascination, and worn his best shirt, the one usually reserved for trips to the bank or rare church attendance. At precisely 7 o'clock, a knock came at the door. Tommy raced to answer it, returning moments later with Penelope. She'd worn her hair differently, loosely braided and draped over one shoulder, with a few curls framing her face. Her dress was a deep blue wool that emphasized her slender waist and brought out the gold highlights in her hair. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. Good evening, she greeted them, her cheeks flushed from the cold outside. I've brought apple preserves from last fall's harvest. The ladies of the church taught me canning when I arrived. Mrs. Carson accepted the gift with obvious approval. How thoughtful, Miss Dawson. They'll pair beautifully with Mr. Quinn's biscuits. Dinner was a surprisingly easy affair. Penelope drew out Tommy's stories of ranch life, listening with genuine interest to his descriptions of helping with calving and learning to rope. She shared amusing tales from her teaching experiences, both in Boston and Whispering Pines. Zach found himself laughing more than he had in years, relaxed in a way that should have alarmed him, but somehow didn't. How did you come to teach in Whispering Pines? He asked as Mrs. Carson served coffee and her famous apple pie for dessert. Boston to Montana territory is quite a journey for a young woman alone. Something flickered in Penelope's eyes, a shadow quickly masked. My father was a professor at Harvard. He believed passionately in education, particularly for those with limited access. She took a sip of coffee before continuing. After he passed last spring, I found myself at a crossroads. I could remain in Boston, perhaps marry one of his colleagues as everyone expected, or I could honor his beliefs by bringing education to those who truly needed it. That took courage, Zach observed quietly. She met his gaze directly. No more than raising a child alone on a remote ranch, I imagine. The understanding in her voice touched something in Zach that had been walled off since his brother's death. Tommy makes it worthwhile, he said simply. After dinner, Mrs. Carson tactfully excused herself to visit a neighbor, leaving Zach and Penelope sitting by the fire while Tommy proudly showed his school compositions. When the boy began to yawn, Zach sent him upstairs to prepare for bed. I'll be up shortly to say goodnight, he promised. Alone with Penelope, Zach suddenly felt uncharacteristically nervous. She sat in the lamplight, the fire casting warm shadows across her face, looking so at home in the parlor that he could almost imagine this was their home, their evening ritual. Thank you for coming tonight, he said. Tommy enjoyed himself immensely. As did I. She smiled, the firelight catching golden highlights in her hair. He's a remarkable boy, Zach. Intelligent, kind, and resilient. You've done well with him, especially under difficult circumstances. I'm not sure I deserve such credit, he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. Most days I'm just trying to keep us fed and the ranch running. There's little time for the things a boy really needs. Yet you teach him to read, to count, to be honorable, she countered gently. Those are the foundations of character. Zach stared into the fire, gathering courage for what he needed to say. I've been thinking about your suggestion. About the Watson family. Her expression remained carefully neutral. Yes. If they're truly willing, and if Tommy agrees, perhaps an arrangement could be made. He could stay with them during the week and return to the ranch on weekends when weather permits. During the worst of winter, perhaps longer separations would be necessary, but you're considering it? The hope in her voice was unmistakable. His education matters, Zach said simply. You've shown me that. And seeing him these past weeks, how he's thrived, how excited he is to learn, I can't deny him that opportunity, even if it means. He faltered, unable to express the fear that Tommy might grow away from him, might choose books and learning over the ranch life Zach had planned for him. Penelope leaned forward, her hand briefly touching his arm. It doesn't mean losing him, Zach. It means giving him wings as well as roots. The touch of her hand, warm even through his shirt sleeve, sent an unexpected current through him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that had been building since their first meeting in the mercantile. The moment was broken by Tommy's call from upstairs. Papa, I'm ready for bed. Zach cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting. I should, of course. Penelope stood, gathering her shawl. Thank you for a lovely evening. I should return home before the hour grows too late. I'll walk you, Zach said immediately, concern for her safety overriding any awkwardness. Just let me say goodnight to Tommy first. Upstairs, he found the boy already tucked beneath quilts, his eyes heavy with sleep, but fighting to stay awake. Did Miss Dawson like our dinner? He asked as Zach sat on the edge of his bed. Very much. She enjoyed your stories especially. Tommy smiled sleepily. She's nice. And pretty. Like I imagined Mama was. The innocent observation struck Zach speechless. Tommy had been barely 3 when his mother died. His memories of her were already fading, preserved only in the stories Zach and Martha had told him. Your mama was beautiful, Zach said finally, smoothing Tommy's hair. And kind, like Miss Dawson. Papa. Tommy's voice was drowsy now, edges softened by approaching sleep. Do you like Miss Dawson? She's a fine teacher, Zach replied carefully. But do you like her? The boy persisted. The way Mr. Peterson likes Mrs. Peterson? Zach found himself without a ready answer. Did he like Penelope Dawson? The question seemed insufficient for the complex feelings she stirred in him. Respect, admiration, a strange protective instinct, and something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in years. Sleep now, he said, kissing Tommy's forehead. We'll talk more tomorrow. By the time he returned downstairs, Penelope had donned her heavy coat and was waiting patiently by the door. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air as they walked in companionable silence toward her cottage. I meant what I said earlier, she said finally as they approached her door. About Tommy. You've raised him well, despite circumstances that would challenge anyone. I've done my best, Zach admitted. though I fear my best falls short in many ways." She turned to face him, her expression earnest in the moonlight. "The measure of a man isn't perfection, Zach. It's the courage to keep trying, to adjust course when needed, to put another's needs before his own. By that measure, you're succeeding admirably." Something in her words, or perhaps in the way she looked at him, as if seeing value beyond his utility as a rancher or provider, broke through a barrier Zach hadn't even realized he'd constructed around his heart. "I've lived by simple rules," he said quietly. "Keep working. Stay strong. Don't depend on anyone." It seemed the only way to survive out here. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I'm not so sure." He met her gaze directly. "These weeks in town, watching Tommy flourish, seeing how people help each other through hardships, it's made me question things I thought I knew." She smiled, understanding in her eyes. "The frontier doesn't have to mean isolation, Zach. Perhaps true strength lies in building connections, not avoiding them." They stood before her door, the moment suspended between them like a delicate crystal. Zach wanted to say more, to express the confusion and hope that warred within him, but words had never been his strength. "Good night, Penny," he said finally. "Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for inviting me." She hesitated, then added softly, "I hope we can do it again before you return to your ranch." "I'd like that," he replied, surprised by how deeply he meant it. As she disappeared inside, closing the door gently behind her, Zach stood for a moment in the cold night air, looking up at the vast Montana sky. For the first time in years, the endless expanse didn't feel like a reminder of his isolation, but rather a canvas of possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. The morning brought news that the lumber and supplies for Zach's roof had finally arrived. Logic dictated they should return to the ranch immediately, but when Zach mentioned this to Tommy over breakfast, the boy's face crumpled. "But the Christmas pageant is next week," he protested. "Miss Dawson is counting on me for my part. I've been practicing every day." The raw disappointment in Tommy's voice was a knife to Zach's heart. He thought of Penelope's words about giving the boy wings as well as roots, about connection rather than isolation. "What if," he began carefully, "what if we arrange for the Watson family to watch the ranch for a few days? Old Jim Watson was a rancher before his sons took over the family farm. He knows cattle. We could stay through Christmas, then return to the ranch after." Tommy's face transformed with joy. "Really, Papa? We can stay for Christmas and the pageant?" "If the Watsons agree," Zach said, already wondering at his own decision. The ranch had been his singular focus for so long. Choosing to remain in town, to prioritize Tommy's pageant over immediate repairs, it represented a fundamental shift in his thinking. Later that morning, as Tommy raced ahead to school, bursting with excitement to tell Penelope they would stay for the pageant, Zach made his way to the Watson farm. Old Jim and his wife Mary welcomed him warmly, listening to his proposition with obvious interest. "Be glad to help," Jim said, his weather-beaten face crinkling in a smile. "Been too long since I worked with cattle. And Mary's been sweet on that boy of yours since she saw him helping the little ones at church last Sunday." "He's a fine lad," Mary agreed. "And smart as a whip, from what our Henry says. They've become fast friends at school." "About that," Zach said, seizing the opening. "Miss Dawson mentioned you might be open to boarding Tommy during school terms. I wanted to discuss that possibility, if you're truly interested." The conversation that followed was easier than Zach had anticipated. The Watsons had raised 6 children, now mostly grown and scattered across the territory. Their youngest, Henry, was Tommy's age, and Mary admitted the house felt too empty with just the boy at home. They would welcome Tommy's company, treat him as one of their own, but respect that his home and future lay at the Quinn Ranch. By the time Zach left, they had worked out a tentative arrangement to begin after the new year. Tommy would stay with the Watsons Monday through Friday, returning to the ranch on weekends when weather permitted. During the worst of winter, visits might be less frequent, but Zach would come to town as often as possible. It wasn't a perfect solution. The thought of nights without Tommy's presence in the cabin still twisted something painful in Zach's chest. But watching the boy these past weeks had made one thing clear. Tommy needed more than Zach alone could provide. He needed education, friendship, community, all the things Penelope Dawson represented. When school dismissed that afternoon, Zach waited with uncharacteristic nervousness. Tommy burst out of the schoolhouse, practically vibrating with excitement. Miss Dawson says I can still be in the pageant, he announced. And she's going to help me practice my lines every day after school. Behind him, Penelope appeared in the doorway, her expression warm as she watched Tommy's excitement. When her eyes met Zach's, something passed between them, a shared understanding, a mutual investment in Tommy's happiness. Mr. Quinn, she greeted him. Tommy shared your wonderful news. We're all delighted you'll be staying through Christmas. I spoke with the Watsons this morning, Zach said, watching her expression carefully. We've made arrangements for Tommy to board with them during school terms, beginning after the new year. Joy bloomed across her face, transforming her already considerable beauty into something that caught at Zach's breath. That's wonderful news. Tommy will thrive with such an arrangement, and the Watsons are a lovely family. It was your suggestion, he reminded her. And you were right. A slight blush colored her cheeks. I'm just happy it's worked out for Tommy's benefit. She hesitated, then added, since you're staying through Christmas, perhaps you'd consider helping with the pageant? We're in need of adult volunteers to assist with scenery and costumes. I'm not much for sewing, Zach admitted with a small smile. But I can handle a hammer and saw well enough. Perfect. The shepherds need a proper stable. Could you come by the church tomorrow afternoon? The children will be rehearsing, and the men of the congregation are gathering to work on the sets. Just like that, Zach found himself drawn deeper into the community of Whispering Pines. The next day led to the next, and soon he was spending every afternoon at the church, working alongside men he'd previously known only in passing. Evenings often found them at the schoolhouse, where Penelope held additional rehearsals for the children with speaking parts, including Tommy. Watching her patient instruction, her gentle encouragement when a child struggled with lines, her obvious delight in their successes, it stirred feelings in Zach he'd thought long buried. She brought the same passionate dedication to the Christmas pageant that she did to her teaching, infusing the children with her own enthusiasm and belief in their abilities. One evening, as they walked back to the boarding house after a particularly successful rehearsal, Tommy skipping ahead with his friend Henry Watson, Penelope turned to Zach with curious eyes. May I ask you something personal? When he nodded, she continued, Tommy speaks of his Aunt Martha who died last winter, but rarely mentions his mother. Has she been gone long? My brother James and his wife Elizabeth died when Tommy was 3, Zach explained, the old grief a dull ache now rather than the sharp pain it once was. Influenza. James was my only sibling, younger by 2 years. I'm so sorry, Penelope said softly, to lose both parents so young. Martha, James's sister-in-law, took him in. She never married, devoted herself to raising Tommy. Zach's voice roughened. When she fell ill last winter, I was helping her with the boy already. It seemed natural that he would come to me when she passed. Though you hadn't planned on fatherhood, Penelope observed gently. No, Zach admitted. The ranch was my life. Still is, in many ways. But Tommy. He looked ahead to where the boy was laughing with his friend. He changed everything. Children have a way of doing that, she agreed. Of making us reconsider what we thought we knew about ourselves and what we want from life. What about you? Zach asked, realizing how little he knew of her past beyond her father's profession. Did you leave family behind in Boston? A shadow crossed her face. My mother died when I was 16. My father raised me alone afterward, much as you're raising Tommy. We were very close. When he died, there was nothing keeping me in Boston except expectations I had no interest in fulfilling. Expectations. She smiled wryly. My father's colleagues assumed I would marry one of them, preferably Professor Harrington, who at 53 considered himself quite the eligible bachelor for a 23-year-old spinster. 23 is hardly spinsterhood, Zach protested, surprised by the surge of indignation on her behalf. In Boston society, it's perilously close, she replied with a hint of mischief. Especially for a woman of limited means and excessively educated mind, as Professor Harrington once described me. His loss, Zach said simply, and Whispering Pines' gain. The smile she gave him then, surprised, genuine, touched, warmed him more effectively than any fire could have in the December chill. As Christmas approached, the pageant preparations intensified. The evening before the performance, Zach found himself alone with Penelope in the church, making final adjustments to the scenery while the children's choir practiced carols in the schoolhouse under Mrs. Peterson's direction. I think the stable is finally sturdy enough, he said, stepping back to survey his handiwork. Though I doubt the original was quite so well constructed. Penelope laughed, a sound that had become increasingly precious to him. I'm certain Mary and Joseph would have appreciated your craftsmanship. She ran her hand along the smooth wood of the manger. It's beautiful, Zach. Thank you for all your help these past weeks. I've enjoyed it more than I expected, he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. Being part of something larger than just the ranch and my own concerns. She nodded understanding. That's what community is, sharing burdens and joys, making something together we couldn't create alone. I never saw much need for it before, Zach said quietly. The ranch was enough. Or so I thought. And now? She looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting the candlelight that illuminated the church. Now I wonder what else I might have been wrong about. He held her gaze, gathering courage for words that had been building in him for days. Penny, the church door burst open, admitting Tommy and Henry, breathless with excitement. Miss Dawson, Mrs. Peterson says to tell you the choir is ready whenever you want to hear them. The moment broken, Penelope smiled at the boys. Tell Mrs. Peterson we'll be right there. Just tidying up here first. When the boys had dashed out again, she turned back to Zach. You were saying? But the courage had deserted him. Nothing that can't wait until after tomorrow's pageant, he said instead. You have enough on your mind without my rambling thoughts. She looked as though she might press the issue, but then nodded. Tomorrow, then, after the pageant. As they walked to the schoolhouse together, Zach wondered what he might have said had they not been interrupted. Would he have confessed how thoroughly she had disrupted his carefully ordered existence? How watching her with Tommy had awakened hopes he'd long ago abandoned? How the thought of returning to the ranch without her presence in his daily life had become increasingly unbearable? Such thoughts were dangerous, opening doors to possibilities that could lead to disappointment and pain. Yet as he watched her gather the children for one final rehearsal, her face animated with joy and purpose, Zach knew it was already too late for caution. Somewhere between the mercantile encounter and tonight, Penelope Dawson had become essential to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The church was filled to capacity for the Christmas Eve pageant. Every family in Whispering Pines had turned out, along with ranchers and homesteaders from miles around. Candles illuminated the simple sanctuary, their warm light casting a golden glow over the festive decorations and expectant faces. Zach sat in the front pew, his Sunday best feeling stiff and unfamiliar after weeks in work clothes. Behind the curtain that had been rigged at the front of the church, he knew Tommy was waiting with the other children, probably nervous despite weeks of preparation. A hush fell over the congregation as Penelope stepped to the front, resplendent in a deep red dress that complemented her honey-gold hair, which she wore partly up with soft curls framing her face. She looked, Zach thought, like a painting of an angel he'd once seen in a book, serene, luminous, otherworldly in her beauty. Welcome, friends and neighbors, she began, her voice clear and warm. Tonight, our children will share the greatest story ever told. The story of hope born in unlikely circumstances, of light coming into darkness, of love made manifest in the most humble of forms. As she spoke, Zach found himself captivated not just by her words, but by the woman herself. Her passion for bringing beauty and meaning into the lives of her students, her courage in leaving everything familiar to follow her convictions, her kindness that extended to a solitary rancher and his orphaned nephew. The pageant unfolded with all the charm and occasional humor that accompanied children's performances. A shepherd lost his stick at a critical moment. One of the angels forgot her lines and had to be prompted. The child playing the innkeeper delivered his rejection of Mary and Joseph with such enthusiasm that laughter rippled through the congregation. Then came Tommy's moment. As the first wise man, he stepped forward, his small face solemn with responsibility. The costume Penelope had helped him create, a rich cloak fashioned from an old curtain, adorned with glass beads that sparkled in the candlelight, transformed him from a ranch boy to an exotic visitor from distant lands. I bring gold, he announced clearly, holding aloft a wooden box painted gold, for the child who will be king. He placed his gift before the manger, then stepped back, his posture straight, his expression dignified beyond his years. Pride swelled in Zach's chest, nearly choking him with its intensity. This confident child, standing before the community and delivering his lines without hesitation, seemed miles away from the solemn, withdrawn boy who had arrived in town just weeks ago. The transformation was remarkable and owed much to the woman who now watched from the side, her face glowing with quiet pride. When the pageant concluded with the children's choir singing Silent Night, many in the congregation discreetly wiped away tears. Zach found himself among them, moved not only by the simple beauty of the performance, but by the realization of how much he had changed in these few short weeks. The walls he had built around his heart, the belief that isolation was strength and connection weakness, had crumbled in the face of Penelope's quiet challenge and Tommy's blossoming under her care. Afterward, as the congregation mingled over cider and Christmas cookies, Tommy rushed to Zach, his face flushed with excitement. "Did I do good, Papa?" I remembered all my lines. Zach crouched down, meeting the boy at eye level. "You were perfect, son. I couldn't have been prouder." Tommy beamed, then looked over Zach's shoulder. "Miss Dawson, Papa said I did perfect." Penelope approached, her smile radiant. "He's right. You were a wonderful wise man, Tommy. Very dignified and clear." The boy practically glowed under her praise. Before Zach could stop him, Tommy blurted, "Papa has a Christmas present for you. It's a surprise, but he worked on it every night after I went to bed." Zach felt heat rise in his face. "Tommy, that was meant to be private." "But it's Christmas Eve," the boy protested. "Presents are for Christmas." Penelope's eyes danced with amusement and something warmer. "I wouldn't want to spoil a surprise," she said diplomatically. Saved from immediate embarrassment, Zach directed Tommy toward the refreshment table. "Why don't you get us some cider? I'm sure Miss Dawson is thirsty after all her hard work." When the boy had dashed off, Penelope turned curious eyes to Zach. "You didn't need to get me anything." "It's nothing elaborate," he assured her. "Just a small token of appreciation for all you've done for Tommy. And for me," he added more quietly. "I've only done what any teacher would," she demurred. "We both know that's not true." He held her gaze steadily. "You've changed him, given him confidence, purpose, joy. And you've changed me too, though I'm still understanding how." Something vulnerable flickered in her expression. "For the better, I hope." "Definitely for the better." He hesitated, then added, "I'd like to give you your gift tonight, after the celebrations. If you wouldn't mind stopping by the boarding house later." A slight blush colored her cheeks. "I would like that very much." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, conversations with townspeople who now greeted Zach as a friend rather than a passing acquaintance, and Tommy's excited chatter with the other children. By the time they returned to the boarding house, the boy was nearly asleep on his feet, though he protested when Zach suggested bed. "But I want to see Miss Dawson open her present," he insisted through a yawn. "Tomorrow," Zach promised, carrying him upstairs. "Miss Dawson will come for Christmas dinner, and you can watch her open it then." Tommy was asleep almost before Zach finished tucking the quilts around him. Downstairs, Zach paced nervously, checking the clock, then the small package he'd wrapped in brown paper and string. The gift wasn't elaborate. Frontier life offered few opportunities for extravagance, but he'd poured his heart into creating it. A soft knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. Penelope stood on the porch, her red dress partially concealed beneath her heavy coat, snowflakes dusting her hair like diamonds. "I hope I'm not too late," she said as he ushered her inside. Reverend Hughes wanted to discuss plans for a school expansion in the spring. "Not at all." Zach took her coat, hyper-aware of her presence in a way that made his heart race like a boy's. "Tommy finally surrendered to sleep, though he wanted to stay awake for your visit. Poor thing. He was magnificent tonight." She smiled, her eyes soft with affection for the boy. "They all were, but I admit to special pride in Tommy's performance." "As his teacher, you should be proud," Zach agreed, gesturing for her to sit by the fire Mrs. Carson had built up before retiring. "Your patience and encouragement made it possible." "Children rise to our expectations," Penelope said simply. Tommy merely needed someone to believe in his capabilities. Someone besides his rough-edged uncle. "You mean," Zach said with a self-deprecating smile. "That's not what I meant at all." Her voice was earnest. "Tommy adores you, Zach. You're his hero, his security, his example of what a man should be. I've only supplemented what you've already given him, a foundation of love and safety that makes learning possible." Her words warmed something deep in Zach's soul. "I've tried," he said simply, "but I've often felt inadequate to the task. Until recently." "What changed?" she asked softly. "You did." The admission came more easily than he'd expected. Seeing Tommy through your eyes, I realized I'd been so focused on practical survival that I'd neglected other kinds of nourishment he needs. And perhaps that I need as well. A moment of charged silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Finally, Zach reached for the small package on the side table. "It's not much," he said, offering it to her. "But I wanted you to have something that expressed my gratitude." Penelope accepted the gift with evident emotion. "You didn't need to give me anything, Zach. Seeing Tommy flourish has been reward enough." Nevertheless, he nodded toward the package. "Please." With careful fingers, she unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of wildflowers that grew on the prairie in spring. When she opened it, a soft melody began to play, a simple frontier lullaby that Martha had often sung to Tommy. "Oh, Zach," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "It's beautiful. I carved the box," he explained, suddenly self-conscious. The musical mechanism was from an old music box of Martha's that broke last year. "I've been saving the pieces, hoping to repair it someday for Tommy." He paused, meeting her gaze directly. "But when I thought about what to give you, this seemed right. Music and beauty together, like what you've brought into our lives." A single tear spilled down her cheek. "This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." Without thinking, Zach reached out to brush the tear away, his fingers lingering against her soft skin. "Penny," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, vulnerability and hope mingled in her expression. "Yes. When I came to town, I believed the frontier demanded isolation, that connection was weakness, that a man stood strongest alone." He struggled to find words adequate to the feelings surging within him. "You've shown me how wrong I was. Through your kindness to Tommy, your dedication to your students, your willingness to challenge my stubborn notions." "Zach," she interrupted gently, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" He took a deep breath, facing the most daunting challenge of his life, more frightening than any frontier hardship. "I'm saying that I've come to care for you, Penny, deeply, in ways I didn't think possible anymore. And while I know a schoolteacher with your refinement and education might look higher than a rough rancher with limited prospects." "Stop." She placed her fingers against his lips, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Don't presume to tell me what I might want or whom I might care for." Hope bloomed in his chest. "And what do you want, Penny?" "A life of purpose," she said without hesitation. "Work that matters. A community to belong to." She paused, her eyes holding his. "And a man who sees me as I am, not as an ornament or possession, but as a partner. A man with enough courage to change when life demands it, enough tenderness to love a child not his own, enough strength to admit when he's been wrong." "That sounds like a tall order," Zach said, his voice husky with emotion. "Perhaps." A smile curved her lips. "But I've recently met someone who seems remarkably qualified." The world seemed to still around them, the only sound the soft melody from the music box and the crackling of the fire. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Zach leaned forward. Their lips met in a kiss that began tentatively, but quickly deepened with the release of feelings both had held in check for weeks. When they finally parted, both breathless, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he admitted. "When the storm damaged our roof, I saw it as nothing but inconvenience. I couldn't have imagined it would lead to this." "Life often works that way," Penelope said softly. "Our greatest blessings coming disguised as disruptions to our plans." They talked long into the night, sharing hopes and dreams, fears and doubts. Zach spoke of the ranch, of his hopes to expand it someday, of the challenges and joys of frontier life. Penelope shared her vision for the school, her desire to bring opportunities to children who might otherwise never experience them, her own adjustment to frontier life after Boston's comforts. When the clock struck midnight, announcing Christmas Day had arrived, they reluctantly acknowledged the lateness of the hour. "I should go," Penelope said, though she made no move to leave the comfort of Zach's arms, where she had gradually settled as they talked. "It's Christmas," Zach protested softly, "and the hour is late. The walk to your cottage is short and familiar," she finished for him, smiling. "And while I appreciate your concern, propriety must be considered. I am the schoolteacher, after all." Reluctantly, he acknowledged the wisdom of her words. This precious new connection between them was too important to risk through carelessness about frontier social conventions. He helped her with her coat, lingering over the simple task. "Will you come for Christmas dinner tomorrow?" he asked. "Mrs. Carson has invited several guests, and Tommy would be disappointed if you weren't among them." "Only Tommy," she teased gently. He smiled, marveling at how easily it came now. "I would be devastated," he admitted. "Having found you, Penny, I find I'm reluctant to spend even a day without your company." She reached up to touch his face, her eyes soft with emotion. "Then I shall certainly come. For Tommy's sake, of course." "Of course," he agreed, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "For Tommy." At her door, they shared one more kiss, a promise of all that might be between them, a seal on the understanding they had reached. As Zach walked back to the boarding house through the silent, snowy streets, his heart felt lighter than it had in years. The frontier stretched around him as it always had, vast and demanding, but no longer did it seem a place of isolation and mere survival. With Penelope and Tommy, it had become a place of possibility, of connection, of home in its truest sense. Christmas Day dawned bright and clear, the world transformed by fresh snow that sparkled in the morning sunlight. Tommy woke early, bursting with excitement over the small gifts Zach had prepared for him: a carved wooden horse, a new primer with colored illustrations, warm mittens knitted by Mrs. Carson. "And Miss Dawson is coming for dinner?" he asked for the third time as they dressed for church. "Yes, along with Reverend Hughes and the Watsons," Zach confirmed, adjusting Tommy's Sunday tie with uncharacteristic attention to detail. Tommy studied him with a child's directness. "You look happy, Papa." The simple observation caught Zach off guard. "Do I?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Your eyes are different. Like when you talk about my daddy sometimes, remembering good things." Unexpectedly moved, Zach pulled Tommy into a quick embrace. "I am happy," he admitted. "Happier than I've been in a long time." "Because of Miss Dawson?" Tommy asked with innocent perception. "Partly," Zach acknowledged, seeing no reason to dissemble with the child. "She's a special lady. And because of you, and this town, and Christmas." Tommy seemed satisfied with this answer. As they walked to church, the boy spotted Penelope ahead, greeting parishioners at the door alongside Reverend Hughes. She wore a green dress today that matched her eyes, her honey-gold hair arranged beneath a modest hat trimmed with holly. "Miss Dawson," Tommy called, breaking free from Zach to run ahead. "Merry Christmas." She turned at his voice, her face illuminating with a smile that encompassed both the boy and the man following more sedately behind him. "Merry Christmas, Tommy. And to you, Mr. Quinn." The formality was for public consumption, Zach knew, but he saw in her eyes the same warm recognition of what had passed between them the night before. "Miss Dawson." He greeted her with equal formality, though he couldn't suppress his smile. "A beautiful Christmas morning." "Indeed it is," she agreed, her gaze lingering on his before she turned her attention back to Tommy. "And how did Santa Claus find you this morning, young man?" As Tommy eagerly described his gifts, Zach watched them together, the woman and the boy who had so thoroughly transformed his life in just a few short weeks. The cynical part of him, the part shaped by frontier hardship and loss, whispered that such happiness couldn't last. But for the first time in years, Zach found it easy to silence that voice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The Christmas service was joyful, the church still decorated from the previous night's pageant, the congregation in festive spirits. Afterward, they returned to the boarding house, where Mrs. Carson had prepared a feast that would have done credit to the finest hotel in Helena. The Watsons arrived bearing additional dishes and small gifts, and Reverend Hughes brought a bottle of fine brandy for medicinal purposes only, he announced with a wink. Throughout the meal, Zach found his attention continually drawn to Penelope, seated across from him. They had agreed that morning to keep their new understanding private for the moment, allowing Tommy time to adjust to the idea before making any public declarations. But he caught her watching him with the same barely concealed joy he felt whenever their eyes met. After dinner, as the adults settled in the parlor with coffee and the last of Mrs. Carson's Christmas pudding, Tommy approached Penelope with uncharacteristic shyness. "Miss Dawson," he said, his voice barely audible, "I made something for you. For Christmas." From behind his back, he produced a carefully folded piece of paper. Penelope accepted it with evident emotion. Tommy, how thoughtful. May I open it now? The boy nodded, watching anxiously as she unfolded his gift. It was a drawing, carefully executed with the colored pencils the Watsons had given him that morning. It showed 3 figures standing before a house: a tall man in a cowboy hat, a small boy, and between them, a woman with golden hair. It's you and me and Papa, Tommy explained unnecessarily. At our ranch, when you come to visit us after I start school with the Watsons. Penelope's eyes filled with tears. It's beautiful, Tommy. The most precious gift I've received this Christmas. She embraced the boy, who returned the hug with visible pleasure. Thank you. Across the room, Zach caught her gaze over Tommy's head, his own eyes suspiciously bright. The simple drawing had captured perfectly what he himself had been unable to articulate fully. The hope of a future that included all 3 of them, not just as teacher and student, or even as friends, but as something more. Later, when the other guests had departed and Mrs. Carson had retired to her room, Zach found himself alone with Penelope in the parlor once more. Tommy had finally succumbed to the excitement of the day and was sleeping soundly upstairs. He adores you, Zach said softly, nodding toward the drawing Penelope had carefully preserved. That's the first gift he's given anyone since Martha died. I'm honored, she replied, genuine emotion in her voice. He's an extraordinary child, Zach. So resilient, so eager to love despite all he's lost. Children adapt, Zach observed. Better than adults, sometimes. She studied him thoughtfully. You've adapted remarkably well yourself. From confirmed bachelor rancher to devoted father in less than a year. Not without stumbles along the way, he admitted ruefully. The measure of a man isn't perfection, she reminded him, echoing her words from the night before. It's the courage to keep trying. He took her hand, drawing her closer. I want to try something else, Penny. Something I've been considering since last night. Oh, her eyes held both question and promise. When we return to the ranch after New Year's, when Tommy begins his arrangement with the Watsons, the cabin will be very empty without him. She waited, letting him find his way to the words that seemed both terrifying and inevitable. I know it's soon, he continued. We've known each other barely a month, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. He took both her hands in his. Penny Dawson, would you consider becoming my wife? Not immediately. I know you have commitments to the school, at least through spring term. But perhaps this summer. Joy bloomed across her face, transforming it with a radiance that took his breath away. Are you certain, Zach? Marriage is a significant step, especially for a man who valued his independence as you have. I've never been more certain, he repeated firmly. These weeks have shown me what I was missing, not just companionship, but partnership. Someone to share both burdens and joys. Someone who makes me want to be a better man than I am. He paused, suddenly uncertain. Unless you think it's too soon? Or if your plans for teaching? She silenced him with a kiss, brief but fervent. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will marry you, Zachary Quinn. Relief and joy surged through him. Even knowing it means life on a remote ranch, miles from town. Even understanding the hardships of frontier life. Even then, she assured him. I didn't leave Boston's comforts seeking an easy life, Zach. I came looking for purpose and meaning. Her eyes held his. I've found both. In my teaching, in this community, and most unexpectedly, in you and Tommy. They sealed their engagement with a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally parted, Zach couldn't resist asking the question that had lingered in his mind since seeing Tommy's drawing. When did you know, he asked softly, that this might be possible between us? Penelope smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. I suspected the first day in the mercantile, when you looked so fierce and protective with Tommy. But I knew for certain the day you agreed to let him attend school, when I saw you put his needs above your own preferences. She traced his face gently with her fingertips. That's when I realized you were a man worth loving. And I realized it watching you with him, Zach admitted. Seeing how you respected him, challenged him, believed in him. How you saw not just what he was, but what he could become. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only when the mantel clock chimed the hour. I should go, Penelope said reluctantly. It's been a perfect Christmas, but tomorrow comes early, and I promise to help with the church's charity baskets for outlying homesteaders. Always thinking of others, Zach observed with admiration. One of the many reasons I love you. The words, spoken for the first time, hung in the air between them like a tangible thing. Penelope's eyes widened slightly, then softened with answering emotion. "And I love you, Zachary Quinn, for your strength, your tenderness, your willingness to change. But most of all, for the heart you try so hard to hide behind that frontier reserve." Their parting at her door was bittersweet, tempered by the knowledge that while duty would separate them temporarily, their future together was now assured. As Zach walked back through the silent streets of Whispering Pines, snow crunching beneath his boots, he marveled at how thoroughly his life had changed in such a short time. The storm that had damaged his roof and brought them to town now seemed providential rather than disastrous. Penelope's challenge to his isolated existence had broken through defenses he'd thought impenetrable. And Tommy, dear, solemn Tommy, had found in Penelope something Zach alone could never provide: a mother's understanding, a woman's gentleness, a teacher's guidance. Spring 1880, the wildflowers carpeted the prairies surrounding the Quinn Ranch in a riot of color: purple lupin, golden sunflowers, delicate white daisies. The cabin, substantially enlarged over the winter months with the help of neighbors from Whispering Pines, gleamed with fresh paint. New curtains, sewn by Penelope during the long winter evenings, fluttered at windows that had been expanded to let in more light. On the wide front porch, recently added to provide a pleasant outdoor living space during Montana's brief but glorious summer, Zach stood watching the approach of a wagon along the rutted ranch road. Beside him, Tommy vibrated with barely contained excitement. "Is it time yet, Papa?" the boy asked for perhaps the 10th time that hour. Zach smiled, ruffling the child's hair. "Almost, son. They'll be here soon." The winter had passed more quickly than Zach could have imagined. Tommy had thrived in his arrangement with the Watsons, returning to the ranch each weekend weather permitted, full of stories about school and friends. The boy's academic progress had delighted Penelope, who reported that he was reading well above his grade level and showing particular aptitude for mathematics and geography. Zach had found himself making the journey to town far more frequently than strictly necessary for ranch business. Each visit included time at the schoolhouse, watching Penelope teach, admiring her patience and skill. Evenings were spent in quiet conversation before the fire at her cottage or planning improvements to the ranch house that would make it suitable for a family. Their engagement, announced officially at the church social in January, had been met with universal approval. About time that Quinn boy found himself a good woman. Old Jim Watson had declared loud enough for half the town to hear. Been alone too long, with just cattle for company. The wedding was planned for June, after the school term ended. Penelope had tendered her resignation effective at that time, a decision that saddened the school board but surprised no one. Arrangements had already been made for Tommy to continue his education in town, staying with the Watsons during the week, but his primary home would be the ranch with Zach and his new wife. Now, as May sunlight bathed the prairie in golden light, the day had finally arrived for Penelope to visit the ranch for the first time. After the winter thaw, Zach had been consumed with preparations, building the porch she had mentioned wanting, expanding the cabin to include a proper parlor and an additional bedroom, planting the flower garden she had wistfully described during their winter conversations. The wagon drew closer, and Zach recognized the Watsons' vehicle with Penelope seated beside Mary Watson, her honey-gold hair gleaming in the sunlight. Tommy could contain himself no longer and raced down the path to meet them, shouting greetings. Zach followed more sedately, though his heart raced with anticipation. It had been nearly 2 weeks since he'd seen Penelope, ranch work having prevented his usual weekend journey to town. Letters had been exchanged, carried by neighbors making the trip, but nothing compared to seeing her in person. The wagon pulled to a stop, and before Jim Watson could properly set the brake, Penelope was already being helped down by an eager Tommy. "Miss Dawson, did you see the new porch Papa built? And my bedroom has a real window now. And wait until you see the flower garden and the new chairs Papa made and—" "Tommy," Zach interrupted gently, approaching the wagon. "Let Miss Dawson catch her breath before your grand tour." Penelope laughed, her green eyes shining with delight as they met Zach's. "I've been looking forward to this tour all week, Tommy. I want to see everything." She wore a simple traveling dress of blue cotton, practical for the journey, but becoming nonetheless. Her hair was arranged in a loose braid down her back, a few tendrils escaping to frame her face. To Zach, she had never looked more beautiful. "Welcome to the Quinn Ranch," he said, taking her hands in his. Protocol dictated a certain restraint in front of others, but his eyes conveyed all the longing of their separation. "It's even more beautiful than you described," she replied, her gaze taking in the wildflower-dotted prairie, the distant mountains, the creek that wound its way past the cabin. "I can see why you love it so." Mary Watson, observing their reunion with evident satisfaction, announced that she and Jim would stay only long enough for refreshment before continuing to visit relatives who lived further along the valley. "We'll collect Penny on Sunday afternoon," she added, "unless other arrangements are made." The implication was clear. Should Zach wish to escort Penelope back to town himself, the Watsons would understand. Such arrangements were common for engaged couples, allowing them time together while still maintaining propriety through the presence of a chaperone like Tommy. After the Watsons departed, Tommy led Penelope on an enthusiastic tour of the ranch house, pointing out every improvement with proprietary pride. "This will be your room," he announced, showing her the new bedroom Zach had added. "Until after the wedding, Papa says. Then you'll share with him, and this will be for guests or maybe someday a baby brother or sister for me." Penelope's cheeks colored slightly at the boy's matter-of-fact statement, but her eyes, meeting Zach's over Tommy's head, held no embarrassment, only promise. "It's a beautiful room," she said sincerely. "And the whole house is wonderful, Zach. You've worked so hard." "I wanted it to be right," he said simply. "A proper home, not just a bachelor's cabin." Later, after a dinner that Zach had prepared with unusual care, though Penelope insisted on helping despite his protests, they sat on the new porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Tommy had finally exhausted his store of conversation and was contentedly whittling a piece of wood under Zach's supervision. "Are you happy with your school arrangements for next year?" Zach asked Penelope. "I know giving up teaching full-time was a difficult decision." She smiled, the sunset gilding her profile. "The new teacher seems very competent, and the board has agreed to let me continue teaching advanced students 1 day a week. It's a good compromise." Her eyes met his. "And being here, building a life with you and Tommy, is what I want most." Tommy looked up from his whittling. "Will you still be my teacher when you're married to Papa?" "In some ways," Penelope replied thoughtfully. "I'll still help with your lessons, of course, but I'll be something else too." "What?" the boy asked with genuine curiosity. She hesitated, looking to Zach for guidance. This was a conversation they had anticipated but not specifically planned. "Well, son," Zach began carefully, "when Miss Dawson and I are married, she'll be my wife and your—" He faltered, unsure how to proceed. "Your stepmother, officially," Penelope supplied gently. "But what that means, what you call me, would be entirely up to you, Tommy." The boy considered this seriously, his small brow furrowed in thought. "Would you be like my mama?" he asked finally. "Not exactly like her," Penelope explained, her voice tender. "Your mother will always be your mother, and very special. No one can replace her. But I would love you and care for you as if you were my own son, if you'd let me." Tommy was silent for a long moment, digesting this information. Finally, he set aside his whittling and moved to stand before Penelope, his expression solemn beyond his years. "Can you be my mama?" he asked simply. "Not to replace my first mama, but to be my mama now? Papa says everyone needs a mama's love, and I haven't had one for a long time." Tears filled Penelope's eyes. She opened her arms, and Tommy stepped into her embrace without hesitation. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I would be honored to be your mama, Tommy. With all my heart." Over the boy's head, her eyes met Zach's, sharing the profound significance of the moment. In Tommy's simple question and Penelope's answer, their separate lives had truly become one. No longer teacher and student, or even future stepmother and stepson, but mother and child, connected by choice and love rather than blood. As the last light faded from the sky, stars emerging like diamonds scattered across velvet, Zach joined them, his arms encompassing both Penelope and Tommy in a family embrace. The ranch stretched around them, no longer a place of isolated struggle, but the foundation for a shared future. In the silence of the Montana twilight, broken only by the distant call of a nightboard and the soft murmur of the creek, Zachary Quinn finally understood the truth that had eluded him for so long. The frontier's greatest challenge wasn't survival against the elements or isolation in the wilderness. It was finding the courage to open one's heart to love, despite the risks of loss and pain. In Penelope's gentle strength and Tommy's innocent question, he had found not weakness, but the greatest strength of all, the power of family, of connection, of belonging. As they sat together on the porch of the home they would share, Zach silently thanked the storm that had driven them to town, the damaged roof that had seemed such a calamity, and most of all, the green-eyed schoolteacher whose quiet challenge had transformed not just Tommy's life or his own, but all three of their lives, forever.